The work he's done is to partner with people in China who have a vision of the Great Command and how to share it, and to help to make sure they have the resources to carry out the vision that they have. He is a man deeply committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. He is motivated by the Great Command. Myron?
Thank you, Father Michael, for the invitation. Thank you to the U.S.-China Catholic Association for this opportunity. It's a real privilege to be here with you. I've been in China for a number of years. I did my first trip to China in 1981. Oddly enough, with a women's basketball team. I wasn't one of the players, but I was traveling with the team. And then I went back in 1982 and 1983. I was working at a Christian liberal arts university, and they were sending student teams over, and I was going with these different teams to China. One of the things that struck me during those days was everybody thought China was really weird. For me, I realized it was different, but it kind of made sense to me. And that's how God started working in my heart that he wanted me to go to China. In 1981, 82, and 83, China was very much like North Korea is today. I was nervous carrying Bibles through customs in those days. But I asked for 1 year's leave of absence in 1984 to go and teach in China. That 1 year leave of absence kept extending, and now it's been over 35 years that I've been working in China. I've seen a lot of changes in China. When I first went to China in those first few years, we would go out into the streets and try and meet people. I found people in Shanghai were very, very eager to practice their English again, So we'd be almost overwhelmed by people who wanted to talk to us as foreigners. But when I was in Beijing, I found people very, very reluctant to talk to us. They were fearful of talking to us back in 81, 82, and 83. And so when I went as a teacher, obviously I wanted to go to Shanghai. That's where I could really do some good work. But God had other plans. He sent me to Beijing, where I didn't want to go. And then he sent me to People's University, the Communist Party school. And I thought, God, what are you doing? You made a mistake. But now in hindsight, I know why he did that, and it's been a real, real privilege. And People's University was a place where I was teaching for 4 or 5 years. And then I moved on into the corporate training a little bit. I worked at China World Trade Center doing training for a new facility that was going up. And that gave me another kind of experience, seeing how, in China there's a dual system. There are the civil servants who do the work, and then there is the party kind of parallel system of government that kind of makes it work the way they want it to work. And I realized during the Tiananmen Square event in 1989 just how much that complicated life in China for people there. And so through those times at People's University, I learned a lot of lessons, and then I learned a lot of other lessons through that time working at the China World Trade Center. That's me, much thinner, and working in China a number of years ago. I'm supposed to talk about the Protestant experience in Post-Mao China. Now, I was at a session last evening, and you were talking about what's been happening within the Catholic Church the last several years with different things, all right? First of all, some disclaimers. To assume that China is monolithic in its history, ethnic composition, political reality, religion, culture, or the church is to really just to fail to understand how complicated China is. China does not lend itself to just simple analysis. I'm going to be making some generalizations today. And also this presentation is going to be far from exhaustive. It's going to be just very selective, talking about from my own experiences in China. This is the basic outline. These are the points we're going to try and cover. Even though we're talking about the last 4 decades, I think a lot of what happened historically through the 19th century really impacts what's happened today and how, the perception of the Chinese today. So we're going to lay that foundation first. Then we're going to talk about the changes in China, the changes in the church that we've seen over the 40 years. We're going to talk about the development of the unregistered church or the house church, development of the registered and the ThreeSelf Church, interaction between the registered and the unregistered churches. That dynamic is often interesting. The China church interaction with the international church, and then finally the China church in transition, and that's a discussion about what's been happening over the last 5-6 years in China. First of all, the modern historical context. These were what I would call the different eras. You Catholics, you went into China much earlier than we Protestants did. And we got there by the 19th century. But these were kind of the four periods that I see in the Protestant era of missions in China. During the Qing dynasty and the era of Western imperialism, there was massive missionary movement efforts mobilized. In 1807, Robert Morrison, he translated the New Testament into Chinese. He was the first Protestant missionary. He arrived in Guangzhou, but he was also there with the East India Trading Company. And that's created problems yet today. Far Eastern Trading Company was notorious for exploiting India, China, wherever they went. And the missionary would say, well, that's not my work. I was there doing something else. I was just doing translation for them. The problem, what we didn't realize, is that China is such a strong relational culture. They do not compartmentalize in the same way that we do. And so the work of the Far East Trading Company was also associated with the very work that the missionaries were doing at the same time. Carl Gustav, he actually worked with the British diplomatic mission during the Opium Wars and helped in the decision for Hong Kong to be seceded to the British. In 1839, 1860, through Britain's military power, China forced to open her ports to trade. China didn't want that, as you know. Opium Wars. Chinese were humiliated by the defeat. And then the unequal treaty was signed, but 5 ports were open to foreign trade. Foreign residency also, and missionaries came along with that. And again, so missionaries made an advance based on China's humiliation in the war. Then during the pioneering time in 1842, Hong Kong was seceded to Britain under the Treaty of Nanking. Foreigners were resented even more. By 1860, 22 mission stations, 150 missionaries with 350 Chinese converts in these 5 open ports. Then in 1860, the Treaty of Nanjing gives missionaries freedom to travel. Another humiliation, the Treaty of Tianjin, and then missionaries were able to travel and reside anywhere in China. And then during the expansion time, the Qing government was seen as too weak to oppose the West. The Treaty of Beijing permitted missionaries to own land, to build churches, to propagate Christianity in China's interior. By 1900, there were 112,000 Chinese Protestant converts, over 2,000 foreign missionaries, 1,600 Chinese Christian workers. Then in 1900, 1901, you had the Boxer Rebellion, Catholics, as well as 235 foreign missionaries and children were killed during that time, the Boxer Rebellion. And then the Army of 8 Powers came in, using that as an excuse to attack China. There was 40 years of political upheaval. The most urgent thing, and you're going to hear this again and again, even as it's happening today, the national salvation. How do we, right now, the key thing for the party is how do we preserve the party? How do we preserve the Communist Party? Nationalism began to replace Confucianism in the culture. And then in 1911, 1949, Republic of China, 1922 to 1927, anti-Christian, anti-foreign movement causes missionaries to leave their stations. This was all before the communists came. I think that's important for us to understand. We often say it's about the Chinese government. The spiritual battle is not with the Chinese government. The spiritual battle is with the hearts and souls of the people of China. And that's the one thing we have to keep in mind, Catholic or Protestant. There was a history of mistrust of religion, the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties. Missions was viewed as colonial, imperialistic, subversive. In 1949, when the communists came in, there were 800,000 Protestants and about 3 million Catholics. But I think the common misconception is communism is the primary source of repression of Christianity. Culture has a much stronger hold on keeping people from Christ. Communism, while repressive, I believe, actually broke the back of the Chinese culture. They left a value void that left people searching for something. If you look at Chinese society in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, the Chinese diaspora, the growth of Christianity in all those has remained quite static. But in the last 40 years, there's been a huge growth of the church within China. And frankly, I wish it could have been done a different way, but I think it's because of the Communist Party that growth has happened. Changes in China, changes in the church. Again, we forget that China was like North Korea 40 years ago. And this is for 20% of the world's population. Just the logistics of making something grow so fast, so quickly, is just hard to realize. In 1981, 20% of China's population was urban. Today, 61.5% of China's population is urban. Changes in the infrastructure. This is a picture I took of a friend in Pudong. Pudong is it's a district of Shanghai, across the harbor. This was in 1990. In 1990, there was just a couple of warehouses on the other side of the harbor, 2-3 stories. This is a picture from 2012, just 12 years later. And this is what that harbor looks like today. Changes in wealth. This is according to World Bank. These are not Chinese statistics. In 1978, 270 million people were in poverty. There was no middle class. In 1996, less than 20 years later, they reduced that number of poverty by 2/3. Less than 90 million people in poverty, with the number decreasing rapidly. A rapidly growing middle class has developed over the last 40 years. Affluence on the roads. I took this picture in 1984. There were no private cars in China in 1984. 2021, there's 5 expressways, loops around Beijing. And this is what the streets look like in Beijing. It's an Olympic year. We got to talk about the Olympics. 1984, when I was doing training for my first year in China, I was down in Pasadena for the Olympics to see the Chinese team come in. The first time that they participated in that international event. And then in 2008, they hosted the largest games, spending the most money that has ever been spent on an Olympics event. Changes in the church. In 1949, 800,000 Protestants, 3 million Catholics. In 2010, 3 million Protestants and Catholics, and that's 23 million, and that's according to the Chinese government. 58 million Protestants and 9 million Catholics, according to the Pew Center. In 2010, they were saying about 1 million new believers were being added to the church every year. And that's the Chinese government statistics in 2010. Missions were saying 10,000 new Christians were coming to Christ daily. 3.6 million people a year. And some mission statistics even had it at 20,000 coming to Christ daily. I'm taking the most conservative numbers that were out there. So China has changed fast. Development of the unregistered or the house church. This is from Chen Qing. That's his pen name. He's done some writing for China Source. He has put the development into these 3 phases. Phase 1, the resurrection and the revival, from the 1970s to the 1990s. Then in phase 2, the golden age of church growth. And frankly, I don't like that term, the golden age, but that's the one he's using, of church growth from late 1990s to the mid-2010s. And then he talks about phase 3, the new reality and new possibilities. And that's from mid-2010s. It's like from 2015 to the present. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of this presentation, phase 3. Phase 1, resurrection and revival. It started in the countryside. The church was very, very rural, older, and uneducated when I first went to China. But then later it moved to the urban area. And I think, one of the things that I've just, being as a teacher, going to China, teaching English, actually, my church did not appreciate what I was doing when I went over to China in 1984. They wouldn't support me or help me. You're an English teacher. They would ask me the question, well, you're an English teacher or a missionary? It's like, why does there have to be a choice? But that was one of the struggles. But I think one of the things that you see in China now, the church is growing most rapidly in urban areas among well-educated, professional people. And I think it's the result of years and years of teachers in the universities having an impact on students. And it's just been a real privilege to be a small part of that. The church was largely shaped by a fundamentalist legacy. There was a number of indigenous, independent churches, and then there was also a sizable church networks called the Tundui. And that was like we talked about the uncles. They had kind of a hierarchical structure, and these uncles were kind of the head of these different Tunduis. And then they were very evangelistic. They were non-denominational, which was wonderful coming from the United States. and they were very hierarchical. Then in phase 2 was the golden age of the church. Age of optimism, church growth. You might even say pride a little bit in how they were going. There was an extensive foreign involvement, particularly in the urban areas. There was an introduction by the West of denominationalism in China at that time. The megachurch model from the US and South Korea became much more widespread. And then you had the church planning ideas and techniques from overseas were also being copied. A well-known pastor that I know, ThreeSelf pastor, got his D.Min from Fuller Seminary. He did his thesis on church planning, and he's a ThreeSelf pastor in China. I break up what happened in China in a little different way. I like to talk about chapters of development with China. In the early 80s, it was very much about pre-evangelism, bringing somebody from a -10 to a -2 in their ability to accept the gospel. I remember talking to somebody in Beijing back in the early 1980s, and I asked him, do you know who Jesus is? Do you know who Jesus is? And his response was, does he live in Beijing? There was no frame of reference, no context. He had never heard the name before. It was an era of pre-evangelism. Then Tiananmen Square, June 4th, 1989 happened. There was a crisis of confidence in the hearts of the people. And we saw a huge number of people starting coming to Christ shortly after Tiananmen Square in the early 1990s. Then there was a real crisis then at that time about how do we train the leadership for this so rapidly growing church. A very famous house church, well-known house church pastor today in the central part of China, became a Christian and was actually leading a church 6 weeks after he had become a Christian. That obviously has a lot of problems, but there was just no other place for him to go. And he wanted to start sharing people what's going on. So that was a real challenge. How do we train leadership for this such rapidly growing church? And then in these previous years, the church was still very, very much in hiding. It was very much about how do we protect ourselves. And then the church started thinking about how do we be salt and light? How do we be the city on the hill? And that's when you had large house churches who had a lot of different cell groups actually gathering together for public worship, renting the entire floor of an office building. One of the house churches that I've been to in Beijing, they have their own bookstore, they have their own seminary, they have their own coffee shop. And if you have 10 cups, you get your 11th cup free. They have a rewards program at the coffee shop. I mean, it was a very, very different time. They have all the technology for their worship. They started setting up websites. They put up websites for 2 reasons. One reason was to kind of protect themselves because the government was criticizing them as preaching against the Chinese government. So, hey, all of our sermons are up online. You can see what we're saying. We're not criticizing the Chinese government. And then they also put them up because they knew that there were officials that were interested, curious about what was going on with these Christians. But they would never be able to go to a church because of their position. And the website gave them an opportunity to hear the message of the gospel. And the church started doing that. Another thing that happened during that time was when the big Sichuan earthquake happened in 2008, just before the Olympics. Over 200 house churches worked together in the name of Christ to provide relief to people in the Wuhan or in the Sichuan area where that happened. It was a privilege to be able to work with that. And then the church became kind of a teenage church. And by teenage, I meant, you know how teenagers are. Teenagers sometimes, I'm single, I haven't had children, but I've been told, there's a sense of invincibility. There's a sense of not wanting to listen to wise counsel. There's another air about teenagers, a little bit of a pride or whatever. And there was a little bit of that going on within the Chinese church. And keep in mind, because of the history of China, there were no adult churches to look at. There were no adult churches to model themselves after, where they had seen people growing up in the faith and churches developing in the faith and all that sort of thing. They were very much all doing it on their own for the first time without any kind of instruction. But now you have a Chinese church that's a sending church. It's amazing to see a church that's sending out its own missionaries. And there's problems and there's challenges with all of that. But you see this, one of the things I've been so privileged to see in my lifetime in China is to see it go from pre-evangelism to be a sending church within my ministry lifetime. Where has that happened in the world? I know missionaries to Japan that have been there for years and years and years and not seen that kind of fruit. But what a privilege it's been to see what's happened in China over the last 40 years. The development of the registered or the ThreeSelf Church, now we're moving to the official church. From the 1970s to the 1990s was primarily hemmed in by political leadership within the church. My first visit to China in 1981, I went to a ThreeSelf Church in Shanghai. We had the privilege, we had a translator, they were telling us everything that was going on. And then we had a privilege to meet with the pastor and stuff after the service too, and had a good long hour discussion with him. To be frank, I was very unimpressed. It was just all political speak. It was not good. But I remember seeing an older woman there, and she just seemed very, very passionate, and she spoke a little bit of English. So I asked her, I said, why do you come here? And her response to me was, this is the one place I can publicly state and identify myself as a Christian. And again, I thought that changed my attitude about the ThreeSelf Church. I didn't like what was happening on the platform. I didn't like what I heard coming out of the platform. But I saw this woman who said, I can identify myself as a believer here. And that just really struck me and has stuck with me to this day. Then, as that political leadership that was established, when the ThreeSelf was kind of first set up, frankly, they started aging out. They started dying. They became quite sick. Some new leadership started coming in, and some of the new leadership had gone to seminary and kind of gone through the route before becoming a pastor post-Tiananmen Square, and were affected in the same way that a lot of the citizens were affected. And so you started to see a fresh new life starting to come into the ThreeSelf Church. My first 25 years in China, I never worked with the ThreeSelf Church. But when I started to see the change that was going on, I thought, there's an opportunity here as well. And so I started to work with the ThreeSelf a little bit more. And then as the house church was having their kind of salt and light, city on a hill era, and we're doing all of these social services, the ThreeSelf pastors were really quite wise. And they said, they went to the officials and said, we can't let this house church, do better than we're doing. We want to compete with them a little bit. Allow us to do more. And the church used that to leverage the officials to get them to become much more active in social work and reaching out into the community, actually doing Sunday schools, that sort of thing. But always in a very clever, indirect way. Like in the churches, there would be what we would call as Protestants a Sunday school for children, where they're teaching them God's word and that sort of thing. But officially, it was childcare. So childcare was okay, even though Sunday schools were not. Foreign preachers are not supposed to preach in the ThreeSelf churches. One of my pastor friends, I would bring different international guests, and he'd have him speak at the church. And he would tell the international speaker that was coming to speak at the church, he would say, why don't you share for 25 minutes and I'll preach for 5 minutes. And so just kind of everybody knew what was happening, but it was okay. They kind of, in Chinese they have a phrase, close one eye. And so a lot of good things started happening within the ThreeSelf Church. Here's a comparison between the unregistered church and the unregistered church and the registered church and what's happened. While there was going through the pre-evangelism and evangelism era in the unregistered church, that was still a very political time within the ThreeSelf Church. But then when we were doing leadership training, starting to do reaching out and becoming a sending church, that's when the old started to go out and the new started to come into the ThreeSelf, and that idea of competing with the house church, with the officials, allowed them to actually do more ministry in the country. I'd like to show you a video. This is in the land of Mao, a rising tide of Christianity. This was an NPR report back in 2010.
Christians break bread in China's Protestant heartland. It's lunchtime at this church. They're marking their annual Husband and Wife Day, a celebration of faith and community. God is rising here in China, says 38-year-old Yao Hong. She's one of about 1,000 worshippers at this church. She believes it's patriotic to believe in God, to pray for China's revival and well-being. By some estimates, China now has 100 million Christians, more believers in Christ than Communist Party members. This is an officially recognized government-sanctioned church, part of what's called the ThreeSelf patriotic movement. Many believers are older. They tell stories of how prayer cured illness, of how being a Christian ended beatings from husbands, of the rewards of faith. Pastor Ni says he believes there's total religious freedom in China. Relations between church and state, he says, are extremely good.
The
government never interferes with our internal affairs. There are no orders, no coercion. That doesn't exist, and we get on well.
About 30 miles away, a group of women prays ahead of a performance. They're from another congregation, also from a government-sanctioned church. Freedom of religion is protected in China's constitution, but proselytizing in public places is forbidden. But the grey areas are growing, and Christians like Wang Meizhen make use of those, spreading the word through traditional skits and plays.
We use folk art to bring in the non-believers. It's difficult for them to walk away. Then we include Christian messages. We want to bring them to God.
Their show on a noisy street includes dances to pop music. There are traditional operas and folk performances heavy with Christian overtones. An arguing husband and wife brought back together by finding God, for example. The crowd loves it. Few are leaving. And at a nearby rural village, these students are openly singing religious songs. China's youth is searching for a new moral framework. Many are revolted by rampant corruption and the huge wealth gap between rich and poor. And for some, the answer lies in Christianity.
In China, a lot of so-called atheists take money to be their God, but only in God's truth can you find real freedom.
After the performance ends, a prayer of thanks. Technically, these young people are breaking the law against proselytizing, but when asked, they don't seem to be aware. And the authorities turn a blind eye, unwilling or perhaps unable to deal with this explosion of faith. These young evangelists are set on saving souls, one village at a time. Once China's youth trundled across the countryside spreading communism. Now they're spreading God's word.
Keep in mind, that's from 2010. 2010, so that was a different era. This was South China Morning Post, a Hong Kong newspaper on Easter Sunday, had this on the cover of their magazine, part of the newspaper. Again, just emphasizing. But one of the bad things I think that happened during this time is there was a lot of talk about there were more Christians than there were Communist Party members. That worried the Communist Party a great deal. And that's when there was, unfortunately, there was a little bit too much pride, I think, in the growth and stuff that was happening at the church. We should have been a little bit more discreet about it. But this was when I first went to China. This is a ThreeSelf Church in Beijing. It was in bad shape. You look up through the roof and you could actually see the stars on Christmas night through the roof of the building. Today, that's the same church. And the remarkable thing about this picture, well, it's a beautiful church, a beautiful building. If you notice, at the base of the building, over on the right side of the main entrance there's like a line of people standing. This is the fourth service of the morning, and people are standing in line to get into church 30 minutes before the service is started. Such a humongous change. And then look at the cars and stuff that are parked in front of the church as well. It's a very different environment. This is the overflow room of that church. And then also in that church, this was on a Sunday around graduation time. It's in the university district. A lot of university teachers, students there. The whole theme of that Sunday was Send Me Lord. And the sermon that Sunday was basically whether you're a university student going home for the summer, you've graduated, you're going to get a new job, you're going to go abroad to study, wherever you go, you need to take the gospel with you. And then at the end of that service, there was an invitation given for who wants to come forward and be prayed for as you take the gospel wherever you go. And you see all the people standing in front facing the camera. That's the number of people that came forward to ask for prayer as they took the gospel out. And this happened within the ThreeSelf Church. A real spiritual awakening. There are good and bad house churches. There are good and bad ThreeSelf churches. The important question in my mind is, are they teaching the gospel? This is from Christianity Today in 2005. I now believe mainland Chinese Christians working inside and outside of China's borders may be reaching a critical mass. There is potential for them to emerge as the new force in global Christianity. Then what's the interaction between the registered and the unregistered churches? The ThreeSelf attitude towards the house church. Frankly, the ThreeSelf in the early days, in the 1980s, early 90s, they facilitated a lot of the government suppression. They were often informants regarding things that were going on in the house church to the government and that sort of thing. But then at the same time, just a few miles from Mao Zedong's birthplace, there's a house church meeting in the sanctuary of the ThreeSelf Church. There was cooperation between the two. One project that I had in the southern part of China, we were working with a number of different churches, and I started to realize, things, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. So I said, which church is this? It doesn't matter to me, but is it the ThreeSelf Church or is it the house church? And they said, we're really not sure. It's just the church, which was refreshing to hear. And then one of the leading ThreeSelf pastors in China, I asked him the question one time. I said, what's your read on the house church and the ThreeSelf Church and that sort of thing? He said, we really need both churches. I said, well, why? He said, well, when the government focuses its attention on the ThreeSelf Church, that's the opportunity for the house church to flourish. When the government focuses its attention on the house church, that's the opportunity for the ThreeSelf Church to flourish. And that was coming from a leading ThreeSelf Church pastor. The house church said, house church attitude towards the ThreeSelf Church, frankly, the past has not been forgotten or forgiven back in the days of informing and all that sort of thing. There's an unwillingness, I think, to allow the ThreeSelf Church to change. There's frequent power plays, I find, unfortunately. I went to a conference of 3 house church pastors in Korea one time. There was over 300 of them there. And I was invited to a lunch where there was just about 10 of us. There was a bunch of house church pastors, and then there was the executive director of the World Evangelical Association and another large evangelical association. And basically, the house church pastors were trying to persuade them not to work with the ThreeSelf Church and only work with them. And I just, I kind of said what I said a minute ago. It's like there are good and bad house churches, there are good and bad ThreeSelf churches. And then one of the house church pastors spoke up and he said, well, we have more pastors who are studying in the United States, preparing in American seminaries to come back and preach than the ThreeSelf Church does. Which church do you want to work with? And I thought, that is nothing but a power play. That's not about God's work. That's my army is bigger than your army. Which one don't you want to be with our army? And I saw this power play coming into place. And I was just so disappointed to hear that, frankly. And then, I don't know if you've heard of Lausanne Conference. It's a global meeting of evangelicals that happen every once in a while. The last one was in 2010 in South Africa. And in that meeting, the leader from Lausanne was connecting with the house church. And the house church, they had a large group of pastors ready and prepared to go, and they were working through it. And then they decided to they were just going to do the house church. They weren't going to do anything with the ThreeSelf Church. And I remember Joanne and Brent and I talking to the leader of that group, saying, hey, we really don't think this is going to work. We really don't think this is a good idea. Invite the ThreeSelf to come along, too. It may not work. But what they did is they decided to invite the ThreeSelf to come later, after the house church was already prepared. And they also were not allowed to come as delegates, but could only come as observers. Well, why be disrespectful in that kind of a way? And then it definitely did not work, and nobody was able to go as a result. But there's frequent power plays, and I think we forget sometimes how much that comes into the situation. One time I took a U.S. delegation of 7 different Christian universities into China, and in one day, the first meeting we had was with the leading house church pastor in one city, and then we met with the leading ThreeSelf Church pastor in that same city, the very next meeting. In that meeting, afterwards, I asked the people, I said, what was your major takeaway? And without a doubt, they said, every single person said the same thing. The ThreeSelf Church said absolutely nothing negative about the house church, but the house church people spent most of the time criticizing the ThreeSelf Church. And I think one of the things I find in the house church, and this is not everybody, this is kind of the generalization and some of the leadership. There's, like I say, in the old days, there was a reason to divide themselves from the ThreeSelf Church. But things have changed within the Protestant movement. And there's just an unwillingness to allow the ThreeSelf Church to make a change. Finally, the China Church interaction with the international community. And there's a lot of challenges here. And there's a lot of good things that happen too. I'm focusing on how we can do things better. First of all, some of the cultural challenges. China is a pragmatic culture. A very good friend of mine is a legal counsel for a number of American or foreign companies that are working in China. He's a believer. He's a great teacher to me about Chinese culture. And he once made the statement, Chinese don't like science, they like technology. And what do I mean? I said, what do you mean by that? And basically, they don't value the process. They just want the product or the result. It's that pragmatism that comes through. It's illustrated in your manufacturing. China has gotten wealthy basically making other people's stuff. How many global brands do you know that's Chinese? There are some, but mostly they've been just making other people's things. So that value expressed in personal faith, a lot of times I find Chinese people, they're just satisfied with knowing the Bible. There's not a strong emphasis in discipleship. There's not a strong emphasis in spiritual transformation, that I become more Christ-like through the years. I know the Bible. And then how does that impact the church? Reliance on guanxi, relationship. So in Wenzhou, you probably heard the story of a very large church that was torn down. Well, the pastors had done some under-the-table deals with the local officials. It was pragmatic. It allowed them to build a bigger church. But that cultural value negatively impacted the church in that case, and in other cases as well. It's very much a modeling culture. Traditionally looking to the Confucian idea of what's the right way. Today, the right way is maybe a pop star or something, particularly for the young people. But it's illustrated in vocabulary acquisition when I was a teacher. The students would ask me, what does this word mean? And I would try and help them, discover the meaning of the word themselves. And the response was, you're the teacher, just tell us the answer. It's that idea of modeling, copying. Chinese students often have a hard time coming to universities over here because of plagiarism. But in their mind, it's not like they're trying to cheat. It's like, this is the expert. Why would I say it any different than what he said it? That's what's going through their mind. How does that value expressed in the church? Personal faith is that legalism is often a substitute for genuine spiritual transformation of a person. How does it happen in the church? The church has blindly followed Western models of the megachurch model and things like that, just because that's what they do, that's what we're going to do in China. And then China is also very much an imperial culture. There's this Confucian hierarchy. I use a set of slides when I teach Chinese culture. The blue field is the West, the red field is China, boss in a company, that kind of imperial culture. That value expressed in personal faith is that many times the pastor, rather than scripture, becomes the ultimate authority. then in the church, that often allows heresies to come into the church, and particularly in rural areas has become a very, very serious problem. But then there's many common missteps on the part of foreigners working in China as well. I think we very much romanticize the persecuted church way too much. And I learned a lesson through one of my nephews. My nephew was found with bone cancer at the age of 9. From 9 to the age of 24, he had something like 30-some surgeries. They took out his bone, put in a prosthetic bone, took the meat off, put the meat back on 30-some times. It was a very, very horrific thing. And what I learned through him, Andrew, his name was Andrew. Andrew, because he had faced death as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, was mature beyond his years. But because he, for 5 years, was not in this regular school system, his socialization was terrible. And he was extremely immature. And it suddenly hit me, that's a lot like the Chinese church. The Chinese church is very, very mature because of the persecution that they went through, particularly in the 80s and in the 70s and that sort of thing. But because they haven't had the natural kind of spiritual growth through interaction with other people, but through the global body of Christ and that sort of thing, in many ways they were immature at the same time. And as we approach them with this attitude of this very, very mature Christian, not realizing that there were parts of their life where they were perhaps immature at the same time. Another mistake I think we often made is we overemphasize the individual human rights thing. Rather recently, one of the major house churches in another city, I won't mention it, was forced to disband. They were wanting to come in and put CCTV cameras into the church. I don't like it either. I don't want CCTV. But, the Chinese government knows who's coming in anyway. What does it matter? And there's nothing in Scripture that says thou shalt not have a CCTV camera, right? But in the ThreeSelf Church, they went to do the same thing. Well, the house church made it a human rights issue and went to the international press, very much encouraged by Westerners. Got them in trouble. The church got shut down, and there were other reasons too, but that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. The ThreeSelf Church pastor, he said, that's a good idea. More people need to know what's going on inside the church. And he put a Jumbotron TV screen on the outside wall of the church so that anybody out on the street could see the services that were going on the inside. And then we failed to recognize how prevalent that power dynamics were, and we unwittingly played it into it. I am very grieved when I see our Western missionaries choosing sides between the ThreeSelf Church and the house church. We, as Westerners, many times have created that division or reinforced that division rather than making it about, are you preaching the gospel? Are you preaching the gospel? Rather than how they are managing doing church. I also find it interesting that the house church says we're not controlled by the government, but the ThreeSelf Church is. I took a seminary, an Asian-based seminary, into China to do a survey trip one time. We met with all different kinds of people, nonprofits, house church, street church, all that kind of stuff. And one of the guys in the debrief made the comment, the government was a part of every single conversation. And I said, exactly. The house church is dealing with the government all the time. They have their way of dealing with it. The ThreeSelf Church is dealing with the government all the time, and they have their way of dealing with it, but it's just different. And then finally, 2015 to the present, the China Church in transition. And it is a time of transition. This is a propaganda poster back from the revolutionary time. It's hanging up in my apartment back in Ohio. And it's in Chinese, and then in English, French, and German underneath, so that we all Westerners all get it too, says, heighten our vigilance, defend the motherland, be ready at all times to destroy the enemy intruder. That's Cultural Revolution days. Now, today at Renmin Gate, the university where I used to teach, there's this sign. And it says, please keep your voice levels down. Please maintain a clean environment. No religious activities allowed. And that's China today. When I first went to China in 1984, I had more opportunity to tell my students what Christians believe in the classroom in Renmin University than I would in the public school system here in the United States. But that is something that has very much changed in China in just the last 5 years. It is a current crisis in China. The public mood of nationalism has marginalized Christianity in China. The government campaign to tighten up control over the Christian community has made it extremely difficult. The church is often caught in the crossfire in Sino-American tensions. And then the pandemic has only exasperated all the difficulty that's happening. Internally, there's theological divisions. And again, unfortunately, that's something I think Westerns have imported into China. And church growth has plateaued. And that's not something that's necessarily surprising. 10, 15 years ago, some of us were talking about, is China going to follow kind of the path of South Korea? After the war, the church grew very, very quickly, the mega churches and all that sort of thing. And then after Korea became more wealthy, more affluent and all that sort of thing, the church started to plateau. And I think we've seen the same thing in China as well. The mood of the church is much more somber, much more sober, even gloomy. But there's soul searching going on in the church. And these are some of the questions that are being asked. What did we do wrong? Were we overly optimistic? How should we share the gospel in this new social context? This is one of the key ones. Is the American denominationalism and the Korean megachurch models viable for the Chinese culture? I'm so glad they're asking that question rather than accepting it blindly. Is it time for the church to go back to the spirit of suffering and martyrdom? 2015 to the present, it's a crisis. And those of you who know Chinese, the Chinese word for crisis is two characters. The one character meaning opportunity and the other character meaning danger. I think one of the opportunities is the suffering is causing the church to ask questions. And I think that's a wonderful thing. The danger is there's a return to the pride of their past suffering. I remember in those days of 80 and 90 and all that sort of thing, there was kind of a period when the church was growing really, really fast. There was kind of an attitude among a number of people that, well, if you weren't a pastor who had gone through suffering, you didn't really have the authority to speak. And I don't want to see that kind of pride in their suffering rise up again. Another opportunity is to return to the elements of the Twin Day, this network that they used to have. And then just one day becoming a kind of power base again. We don't want that to happen is one of the dangers. The new social outreaches that are showing the love of Christ is a wonderful thing that's happening within the church today. But we don't want a social gospel that's void of the reason for the hope that we have either at the same time. So there's opportunity, there's danger. But the China church is resilient. I don't want to minimize the pain that China's going to be going through and that the church is going to be going through in the years ahead. But the China church is resilient. Foreign missionaries have had to leave. Frankly, I think that's a good thing. And I'm one of them. But I think it's a good thing. It's time for the Chinese church to establish their own identity, to become an indigenous church, a Chinese church, not a Western transplanted church. They're strong. They're able to do it. They're asking the right questions. And I'm so glad that God has forced us out. Pastors of both churches have been intentional about preparing their people to stand on their own. And in my last few years of being in China, pastor after pastor after pastor with whom I would meet would say, we're really working at making sure our people have the ability to stand on their own, rather than relying on the pastor. The large congregation are splitting into cell groups. Complacency has turned into passion. There's a spirit of humility in the church that there hasn't been. They're continuing in global missions despite all the difficulty. We were in our meeting last night. Somebody asked the question about, all the Chinese that are going abroad to do construction projects in Africa and everything. There are missionaries from China going to Africa to minister to the Chinese in those camps that are doing the construction projects and things like that. It's exciting to see the things that are going out. Out of necessity, new ministries have developed. And as persecution impacts both churches, there are seeds of a new spirit of unity among all believers within China, which is exciting to see as well. I'm just closing. The real story is not that China's Christians are being singled out for repression, but rather how their creativity and resilience enable them to thrive amidst such opposition. This is something that Brent Fulton wrote back in 2013, and I think it's still applicable today. And I'm so grateful for what God's doing in China. Thank you.
Mr. Youngman, thank you. How would you characterize, or what could you tell us about methods and ways in which the church in America can learn from the Chinese church?
I think the first thing is to have a spirit of humility. I think a lot of times we as Westerners, with a good heart and a good passion, are just very, very eager about giving of what we have. But sometimes we just need to take time to listen. And we don't always listen well. And I think, and this is not a criticism, please understand, I think missionaries in general, Westerners in general, when they go to China, China's a tough place for a variety of reasons. It's a lot more modern now, but it's still a tough place. And so if you have gone there, you've gone there because you've gone with a sense of mission, a sense of drive, you've overcome a number of challenges, and you really want to do something. But sometimes we just need to sit back and rest and listen. And that's the key thing. And one of the things that are with our organization, God's doing amazing things around the world. There's still definitely places for pioneer missionaries and pioneer missions where we need to take the lead. But sometimes we need to find out what God is doing in the country that we're going to and get behind what God's already doing and support it by providing different kinds of expertise, funding, things like that we can provide. Learning to be number two behind Chinese leadership, which again, we as Americans are not always that good at doing that. So that's part of the passion of our organization, and that's one of the things I would recommend. But that's a pretty long lecture and discussion to answer that question.
My name is Marita Grierson, and I chair the Catholic Diocesan Stewards of Our Common Home. Mr. Youngman, I wondered if, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I just wondered if you could paraphrase a little bit more one of your last summary points about responding to social needs, but not to the extent of eliminating hope. And I just wondered if you could speak to that.
Well, I think we can be meeting human need without having I want to be careful not to set up a hierarchy. I think Christ commanded us to speak the word, to share the word, to share the gospel. But he's also commanded, I point to the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan had absolutely no religious motive. And yet he was the one that put oil on the wound, which was comfort, and wine on the wound, who was antiseptic, healing and comfort. And Christ says, do likewise. There was no spiritual motive. But we need, one is not higher than the other, but we need to be doing both. And if we're just doing the healing and comfort without providing the other, we've also failed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Tom Roush from Los Angeles, from Loyola Marymount. I really enjoyed your talk, Myron. It rang all sorts of bells. I'm concerned, I teach theology and I'm very interested in humanism. And my research at present is focusing on this massive demographic shift from Europe and North America to the global South. And China is a very important part of that. But one of the things that concerns me about what's happening in these new churches in the global South is that they tend to be very autonomous, not really interested in relationships with others. I'm glad to hear you emphasizing efforts to bring the ThreeSelf Church and the house churches together. But in China, the Catholics and Protestants don't even talk to each other. And very little, concern to be related to the rest of the church. And you said at some point in your talk, well, the Bible alone, that's enough. That could easily, if they're not really united with the global church, that can collapse into a kind of sectarianism. We've certainly seen enough of that with all of these issues that are being ignored. Immigrants, racism, white supremacy, all. So what about this in China? Is there a concern to be related to the global church?
That's part of what I was pointing out with that thing in there. I mean, that was one of the cultural issues where just knowledge of the Bible was enough. There wasn't about spiritual transformation.
Right.
And I think we have a problem with that in the West as well, in terms of spiritual transformation, where our knowledge of the Word actually changes the way we live our lives. And yes, it's definitely a problem in China, and I am concerned. And that's another thing I think even here in the West I find we don't really grasp that well. We understand the concept of the body of Christ perhaps within our own congregation or within our own spheres. But that idea of, I cannot say I have no need of you, of a congregation in Africa that I've never seen or heard from or whatever, frankly, we don't wrap our heads around that very well. And I think the whole church, Western church, Chinese church, the global South, we need to have a better understanding of what that means.
Both need to learn from each other.
Exactly.
My name's Zach Gibbs. I serve on the board at the USCCA, and I'd be remiss if, as a Catholic, I couldn't take an opportunity to make this about myself. But I'm wondering if you have any examples of in China where Catholics and Protestants are talking to one another or working well together.
I really don't know of too much going on that way.
I'm wondering if the obstacle there is primarily political, cultural, or theological.
Frankly, the church in China is very, very young. Tom shared kind of his experience when he was a young man. You know, things have evolved in the United States in that respect as we've gotten more mature, as we've had our faith a little bit longer. I think China is still in that young teenage phase as it relates to that particular issue still a little bit. So I think that's perhaps yet to come. Yeah.
You know, if I may just share one experience that I had when I was in China, some people approached me and they were just talking about their experience. They were Protestant Christians, and they said, we've had the opportunity to reconnect with our founding denominations. And you had mentioned that, well, maybe the denominationalism was being sort of foisted on China from the West. Yeah. But in fact, these denominations had sent missionaries and nurtured churches, and they treasured those roots and that heritage. And I found that was an interesting and different way of speaking about denominationalism. Not so much me against you, or we're different from that other group, but we have a heritage, and that's important for us. We want to treasure that. And that's a different way of thinking about your roots and your history.
From the Chinese side, I would say, well, it's more relational. It's more relational. Where from the West, you know, it's that relationship. I have a relationship with you, that type of thing. Where with the West, we're trying to make sure they have pure theology as we think of it. And so there's a different, when we're using that terminology, there's a different understanding of the same term.
As a sociologist, I think of churches not just as ideas with people attached to them, right? But as living bodies and their history and so forth. Right. But I also am concerned, though, that sometimes we do inflict our divisions on other places. Yes. And there was painful division. There were painful divisions within the Christian community in the West. And we are learning to heal and to appreciate one another. There were serious issues, but I don't know that they merited what happened in the breakdown in the West. But I do think it's sad to see that replicated in China, where they didn't undergo that history. They just inherited some of the prejudice and different divisions. That was not a gift of the West that we needed to give.
Yeah, and let me just one more qualifier at the end of my talk too. You know, all the bad stuff that you hear going on in China is going on in China. I don't want to give a Pollyanna kind of view of what's happening in China. But part of my purpose here today is to kind of say there is another thing going on in China at the same time, and to kind of present that view at the same time.
Well, I'm Father Bob Syke. I'm a retired priest from the Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, a diocesan priest. I simply want to know why do they call one of those churches the ThreeSelf Church? Why that term, ThreeSelf?
It comes from ThreeSelf. There's three selves. There's self-propagating, self-supporting, and self-governing. Thank you. And it was actually a term used by Western missionaries a number of years ago, and so when China started it, they kind of turned the phrase for their own purposes to exclude foreigners and things of that nature. And that's the official church. That's the what you call a registered church, official church, the ThreeSelf Church. That's all the same thing.
I'm still a little unclear as to the difference between the ThreeSelf churches and the home church. My impression from your talk, and I may have misunderstood, is that the ThreeSelf churches tend to be more approved by the government.
Right. Some people would call it the government church. Some people would call it the government church.
Thank you.
Question from the online audience. There's a lot of people watching online. My name is Cassia Nee, and I work as the project manager of the Chinese language localization effort at Bible Project, a media animation studio aimed at increasing biblical literacy. Over the last 4 years, our distribution strategy in China has grounded to a halt due to pressure from the government. At this moment, we are relegated to distributing over YouTube for those who have VPN and underground Chinese seminaries who utilize our materials to train pastors. Do you have any advice for strategic distribution of Christian media in the age of digital surveillance and censorship?
That's one of the areas that's really been shut down and controlled. Thank you for your question. I like what you're doing. I know other people that are doing some amazing things in China in the media era, or in media, say 3-4 years ago, but a lot of that sort of thing is really being shut down and controlled. However, there are still things going on. WeChat, Zoom, there's prayer meetings, Bible studies. There's a lot of stuff that still continues. And that's part of the resilience of the Chinese. They just find a way to get around it sometimes. But there's, in terms of a strategy, I'd have to have a meeting with somebody sometime to talk to them about that. It's very difficult for media at this point.
Well, thank you very much for everything. What you talked about is very positive and evangelical. Jesus is the one that we should really preach about. I really like the picture that he put there. Put Jesus there. Putting Jesus there is really good. But the spirit of Jesus is very important. And the two things on the side, the Chinese characters, are so important on the two sides. You change the face of the picture, but you really think change the reality of the whole thing. But on the right side of Jesus was saying the People's Republic of China, long live the People's Republic of China. But on the left would be the world people united, like long live of the unification of the people of the world. But you change the picture, but not changing the reality. But think if, as a missionary in China, you want to change what? The face or the real world?
Good point. And I think that, by showing that picture was just to kind of say, this was on a newspaper, and just kind of that whole pride about how quickly the Chinese church is growing. I mean, even the press was acknowledging it. And this was kind of one of the ways. I would not recommend doing that sort of thing, okay? But that was the point. But we want a vibrant church. And that's where some of my concerns are, is that it's not just about knowledge of the Bible, but it's transforming lives, and it's personal. One of the things I tell my board all the time, we work at the strategic level all the time. We're always talking about these big projects and different things like that. But frankly, it boils down to the individual, the heart, the soul. Have they changed? Have they become Christian? Are they growing in the Word? Are they discipling others? Are they reaching out to other people? And it's changing individual lives. And that's what the mission is. That's what our purpose is.
Amen to that. It is, like at the end, you brought the two churches together, the house church and also the ThreeSelf churches all together. But is this the real thing? But we really, as Jesus is out for the lost. The lost. Which one is the lost? We do not know. But to bring people together would be the real mission. We do not go out to see the weight or the ways. From the time there, let Jesus do it. That's my opinion. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Myron, for the presentation. It's very hard for me to hear that Catholics and Protestants do not talk to each other. we as Christians, we all believe in Jesus. If we are not talking to each other, what kind of examples, witness we are offering to others?
Yeah. It's one of the real benefits of what's happening in China now. The suffering that they're going through is starting to bring just the seeds of a little bit of unity between the church and China. So I'm glad to see. Anyway.
That's great. So the question is, as Catholics, as the Second Vatican Council, ecumenical dialogue is huge. We are not only asked to dialogue, we are commissioned, we are empowered to dialogue with each other. How do you see that this ecumenical dialogue between Catholics and Protestants might happen in the near future in China?
Some of our man-made structures that divide us, I think, are going to seem less important as we move forward in China. And so I think that suffering is going to be one of the things that's going to be bringing people together. I don't think that's something that we can manufacture. There's going to have to be a change of heart, maybe on both sides at times. And that's going to take time. It's going to take us, again, as our previous brother just said. Okay. As he just said, it's like changing the hearts of people, and through changing the hearts of people, we see something change. It's not necessarily through a program, I don't think, for there to be real, genuine dialogue.
My question to you is, moving forward, do you think that the ThreeSelf Church local leaders will work in harmony with the house church local leaders? And they're asking, it's Sister Myrna Tordillo from Washington, D.C.
To a certain extent, I think it's already happened. Like I say, there's ThreeSelf churches that actually have house churches that meet in the ThreeSelf Church sanctuary. There's cooperation on that kind of a level. I think there's some cooperation on personal levels. Official levels, it becomes a little bit more difficult, again, just because of the way the Chinese government is set up and trying to keep them. And the Chinese government is, and this is, I think, one of the things we need to be aware of, too, the Chinese government likes this when we as believers are divided, not just Catholic and Protestant, but between the ThreeSelf Church and the house church. They like to divide and conquer as part of the strategy of the government. So it becomes complicated. But there are opportunities to do it on more personal levels, individual levels, rather than a program kind of way.
A question that I had, we sometimes see that when misfortune befalls one person, and we want to run from that person and leave that person to struggle for themselves. Mm-hmm. So I've heard comments even from a Catholic priest in China. I mentioned all these crosses being torn down in his area. And he says, well, it's not really a problem. It's happening to the Protestant churches. Oh, I see. I didn't think about it that way. But we naturally tend to think about our own house first. And you mentioned this divide and conquer strategy. But I think especially when they're suffering, sometimes it can send people to their own houses even more so. So I'm wondering, what is your sense of where we're going with all this?
There's a sense of the government is attacking us, and not just for Christians and Catholics both. And I think there's, like I say, there's the seeds of unity, a better understanding that there hasn't been there before. Yeah.
Would we see Christian churches speaking up for Tibet or Xinjiang, or would that just be too dangerous?
Well, in terms of the human rights types of issues, probably yes.
Now, there are different ways of framing it. I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned that, the house churches frame things in terms of human rights, and that could be directly antagonistic. But there are other ways of framing things to still express concern.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Paul Mariani, I teach here. I study the church in China, write about it. But I'm just wondering, like maybe a story or an anecdote, like when you found that we were in a new moment now. When was it and what happened?
With the church? that time of transition that I'm talking about?
Yeah, because I teach classes on it, and it slowly dawned on me, but I'm wondering, you being on the ground, when did it kind of start to click, like, oh...
Well, one of the things we need to remember, what's happening to the church right now is not just happening to the church. It's happening to whole society. The Chinese government first started to really clamp down on almost immediately as the new administration, the current administration came in, on business first. And then there were new regulations for education. And then there was the nonprofit sector. And frankly, they got to religion last as they were going through this whole process of clamping down on society, the surveillance society. So yeah, you saw it coming. We knew it was coming, I think. So probably, yeah, about 2015 was when, that started coming. And it hasn't really started hitting the church too terribly hard until about 2018, 2019 is when it started hitting the church quite hard. I might have my ears a little bit off, but that's when it kind of hit most. I remember I was talking to a ThreeSelf pastor who's very high profile, very well connected even within the government and things like that. And he made the comment, he said, yeah, 2019 has been a tough year, but 2020 and 2021 are going to be years of suffering. And that was before COVID hit. And so that was a comment from a high-profile ThreeSelf pastor back in 2019.
Sir Carson Towner, again, working with a nonprofit doing relational ministry with China. Do you have anything you'd share about Christian education?
There was a lot of opportunities about it before. That's another area that's become very, very difficult. But there is Christian education going on. There's homeschooling going on in China. It's illegal. But the government has made it much more difficult for... I signed a contract between a Christian liberal arts university and the Communist Party school back in 1986 for cooperation, for sending teachers full-time and all that kind of stuff. That sort of thing would be very, very difficult to happen today. China has not progressed in the way we would like to see. So Christian education is a much, much tougher area. But it is going on. It's indigenous. There's much less foreign involvement in that area at this point. The best way, if your organization is interested in education, I'd say the best way to do it is to find a local leader that has the same heart, passion that you guys have, and let him lead it, run it, and you provide counsel, resources, whether it be expertise, funding, perhaps personnel if there's an opportunity. But it seems, is Martha Chan here? Martha, hi. Yeah, Martha and I were in a meeting a week or two ago. And Martha made the comment, and I agree with her wholeheartedly. She's not hopeful that foreigners are going to be able to return to China. But she's very, very hopeful for what's going to be happening in the church in China during this period of time. And I agree with her.